Father Deacon has asked me to join him for a discussion on the present situation and what the Orthodox response is to these kinds of strange situations. Although I think this situation is kind of novel. I don't know that we've ever had a situation like this. So maybe you can help us understand how to navigate with the Orthodox phronema, this kind of a weird situation we find ourselves in with the CV.
Yeah. So, and there's a lot of fear, concern, and questions, particularly among the Orthodox community. And so I thought it would be good that we talk about and discuss the various issues concerning the pandemic. What is a healthy attitude to have from an Orthodox perspective on the current situation? I'd also like to address, what I'd call some dangerous extremes. I'd also like to address how our hierarchs and bishops are dealing with the situation. In some sense, it's unprecedented, at least at the level of a global level in the type of situation that we're in. And so that makes it unique. We haven't actually dealt with anything like that. And because it's unique and on such a large scale level globally, it presents new challenges for us. So we need to take time to think through this and how to approach it properly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the mistakes, maybe we can get into the mistakes of jumping to conclusions. It's a mistake I made when I was younger. When we don't exactly know what all's going on, we can't jump to conclusions. So that's not to say that there isn't nefarious dealings behind what may be going on, but when we have a gigantic avalanche of information and we don't know exactly what's going on, a lot of the information conflicts, we shouldn't jump to conclusions about what exactly is or isn't the case until maybe down the road we have a better picture of what's happening.
Right, and I'd actually like to address that in our stream today. Given my work in epistemology, epistemology being the theory of knowledge, we think about questions concerning true beliefs and what actually warrants a true belief. What kind of epistemic standards do we hold to before we actually count true belief is actually knowledge? And there's also considerations too when we're thinking about the various evidences, different situations where the amount of evidence, the standard of epistemic justification might be higher or lower in given circumstances. And so all of these things are quite important, especially when we're thinking about that we're going to not only maybe perhaps assent to something, but act on something. That I'd like to present a kind of a nuanced and healthy view of being smart and cautious, weighing all the evidence, thinking critically through the various issues, and not to be rash. Because as you pointed out, that if you remember when we were young, that we tend to think of things in a very rigid and binary way. And then we tend to act with passion and conviction. And this can present dangers, especially given the current situation, which is something that I've noticed perhaps among the young community of Orthodox. And also I think it's important to address that same sort of passion that can happen in one's early years as a convert, that kind of convert zeal. And how do we as Orthodox kind of remedy that? I think that'll be important to talk about in this series.
Yeah, I talked to a guy yesterday that interviewed me for a book he was doing, a younger guy, and that was a lot of the subject matter of our conversation was about when you're idealistic, when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, we're all that way. It's not inherently bad to be that way. It's a natural stage in our process as we mature into adulthood. But we haven't had a lot of lived experience yet when we're 18, 19, 20 most of the time. So we need to actually, in an odd way, the way I put it was, you actually need to make a lot of mistakes because as you get older and you've made more mistakes, you're in a better position to not be as hasty in your assessment of situations, not be as black and white, because you've seen your own penchant for making mistakes.
Right. So, I mean, the first thing to kind of get out of the way is that let's look at this in a mature and a nuanced way, ultimately coming back on our Orthodox faith, because we can't have fear. And the most important thing through this is to be able to not fear, to do our prayers, trust in the Lord. I would recommend, just to start off with, that especially in times like these, where there is so much panic and so much chaos and I can't figure out what's going on, I encourage everyone to read the Psalter. There's some even good online Psalters that have a daily kathisma that will, each day it picks various parts of the Psalter out for you to read. And every day I read it, it's so fitting given what's going on, and it's so comforting. And the more that we can get into that and do akathes and things like that, that's the foundations in which we Orthodox rely on and depend on.
I would add too something that I found helpful if people have a hard time reading a lot, if they're weird with that. I listen to the Psalms on audio a lot too.
That's a great idea. Let's see. There's a site called liturgy.io that I like using. Let's just see here, and maybe I can even link that for. And they have the current kathismata, the Psalter reading for the day, and that's going to change. And they have various other prayers in there that are really good to use. But I like your idea too, that it's okay to have the audio going on, and as you do other things. I'd also suggest that keep busy with something. You know, this is a chance, you're locked in home, and try to be organized, have little projects that you can work on, because when you're left alone and you don't have, this is why monastics work. You'll be left alone with your own thoughts. Boredom can occur. I heard what's really unfortunate with everything going on is the reports coming out that obviously alcohol sales are skyrocketing. That people, this is a sign of boredom and dealing with, perhaps depression that comes about from these kind of lockdowns. So we have some fundamentals as Orthodox that we can use as tools to deal with this. And it's hard to, for a lot of you, it might be difficult that, the normal services throughout the week and the liturgy on Sunday provides a sort of structure for you that helps motivate a lot of us who are spiritually lazy. And we don't have that. And therefore, this is a difficult time that we're going to have to learn to address our own bad habits and learn to work through this. So there still is grace even in such a bad time as this, and the difficulties that we're going through. And what I would encourage everybody is that ultimately God's in control. That I'm trying to remember if it was Elder Piustios who said that, not even a leaf falls from a tree without God's permission, that God's providence, and that doesn't mean God's doing evil things, but God allows evil in as much as he can bring about a greater good, and that all this works for the greater good for those, especially who trust and put their trust in Christ, in the church. And so just keep that in mind. Repeat it over and over again if you have to. So yeah, that's the fundamentals. I'd also like to talk about, as far as the issue of trust, because this ultimately comes as a conversation even within epistemology. But how do we Orthodox deal with what is our epistemology, and what does trust mean for us Orthodox? So what's really difficult right now is that for us Orthodox, the way that we trust somebody or a group of people is incarnationally and in terms of community. That we enter into a life with that person or persons, and this is the church. And we get to know them. And so we can vouch that, look, I know this person because they hold the same values that we do. They practice the same sort of things that we do. We share communally in a life together. And ultimately, that's the way that we Orthodox build our trust within our community. And what's so difficult is that we live in a very strange age in which our governments, our institutions, the state are not only secular and hold values that are oftentimes just the opposite, and even times persecute those of the Orthodox Church. These institutions are so large and so removed from us, so distant from the lives that we live. We don't know who these people are. We don't share a life or values with them. And yet this is where all the information's coming from. And so for us Orthodox, this could be difficult. Who do we trust? Who do we listen to? When we have crises like this. And so that's something that I'd actually like to address. And I think that there's a healthy way to approach that. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that before we go further into, I'm just kind of setting up various things that I'd like to, general themes that I'd like to talk about and concerns that people might have.
No, I'm going to let you take the lead because this is not really an area that I'm too, versed in. So if I have any input, I'll definitely throw it in, but go ahead.
So I think it's important that, like you said, what's so difficult about the current situation, it's not just the current situation. I was thinking about, in many senses, the kind of post-Enlightenment societies that we live in and the types of governments that we live in is really almost a, let's say, non-organic and non-natural way, I think, for man to live, especially when those institutions are detached or even contrary to the life and values that we as Orthodox Christians have.
We live under the aegis of democracy. Everybody's supposed to participate. You have this civic duty, and yet at the same time we're being told that you have no knowledge of any of this. It's not up to you. It's what the experts decide. Sit down, shut up, and follow the experts. So there's a constant kind of contradiction that we're always having to deal with.
And that's difficult for people. And I was just even thinking too, the larger that states get and the more kind of globalization and the rollout of the internet, this presents a unique challenge for us in terms of both trust and processing information, gathering and accumulating evidence, and having a sufficient amount of evidence to actually say that, I actually pretty sure I know this. Because I was thinking about, for example, if you were living in a village in the past, you probably didn't know much about the village next to you.
Right.
And so what you did know is what was going on in your community.
Yeah.
And so if somebody told you your neighbor's house is on fire, well, because the amount of data and information to be processed was so minimal, and the distances in which that information, where that was coming from, was small enough it made it very easy to verify these things. Well, how do I know that? How can I trust that this person's actually telling me the truth? Well, you could actually go out and look and see, well, by golly, my neighbor's house is on fire. Mm-hmm. You probably knew very little about what was probably going on within the nation, let alone, other nations. And it took time for that, outside information to even get to you. But by the time you might have actually heard of a war, it's actually over or something like that.
Yeah.
So everything's kind of slowed down. And now we live in this technological age of almost instant information. And not only that we're no longer just connected to the information of our general vicinity that we live in, but a worldwide information that makes it impossible, virtually impossible, to be able, just at the sheer level of information that's coming in, to be able to actually process that and say what's fact from fiction, what can I trust, let alone when we're actually getting stuff from, other countries from around the world. That presents a very unique problem. And then you add to that there's, there could be possible reasons to give disinformation, especially at the kind of geopolitical level. Mm-hmm. That, when countries are dealing with other countries, in the affairs thereof, it's not like, well, certainly each side is telling the truth when they're contradictory and stuff like that. So I find that the modern technological age presents kind of a breakdown of both trust in the ability to process, and it makes it actually the soil very fertile for manipulation. Mm-hmm. Of data and information.
Absolutely.
And so now kind of bringing this into the current conversation about what's going on with the pandemic is that we have an overload of information that we as individuals are finding it virtually impossible to process. From communities and institutions that don't share the same values as us. That, we could talk about that. These are the same institutions that have terrible track history records of human rights violations, bioethics, ethical sins, especially from the Orthodox point of view. Manipulation of information. These are all, just facts that we know that makes trust even more difficult. And the process of going through the information and determining, well, what can I trust? What's actually accurate and correct? Almost impossible. And it may even be just on a charitable reading. Let's say you could actually fully trust this. It may not even be that the institutions themselves, the medical communities, given that this hit us so fast and so hard, and there's so much data coming in, that they're even able to process this accurately.
Yeah, I think so.
And present us. So we're going to kind of need, like anything, any catastrophe or something like that, oftentimes it's the kind of hindsight 2020 after kind of you've come out of this and you look back and you have more time to kind of accumulate and think through the information that you get a better idea of what's going on. We're in the midst of it. It's really difficult to see. And so I know that must cause a lot of anxiety for people. Now, I would say it's important. What I would encourage Orthodox is that there's nothing wrong with a critical examination of the evidence, doing your very best, while still being safe and precautious, having precautions. And there's nothing wrong with questioning or demanding certain evidence and answers from the medical community, the establishment, your politicians. What's quite frustrating is that usually when somebody, and by the way, questioning is for the purpose of getting answers, right? I mean, that's the whole, unless you're just being kind of sophistical.
Philosophy student.
Yeah, unless you're a philosophy student. And so what isn't helpful, and I see this going on a lot recently, is that those who generally are trying to work their way through a very difficult situation, the way that I've outlined, who are questioning and trying to get the evidence because they're actually sincere, that they actually want a proper solution to this in a moral way, in a way that respects other people, and fundamentally a way that's orthodox. That in questioning some of, let's say, the evidence or the narratives or what's being presented, you get the term conspiracy theory thrown out. This is not helpful at all. First of all, I'd just say from a philosophic point of view, this is what we would call the fallacy of ambiguity. Ambiguous, it's not quite clear what somebody means when they use such a term. Furthermore, it's really kind of a way to shut down conversation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
An investigation. In fact, the term actually comes out from the Warren Commission itself, that to be used anytime that somebody questions the official narrative. Mm-hmm. I mean, so if we just step back from it, that sounds so silly and absurd. What does Scripture say? Question all things and hold fast to that which is good. And now we have even Orthodox saying that people are questioning in the attempt to hold fast to what is good and true and right, are labeled conspiracy theorists. Now, I'm not saying that everything that we could, if we could define it properly, that fits under the label of conspiracy theory isn't actually ridiculous. I mean, I'm sure there's things that, but what I'm saying is that especially in light of a current situation like this, to be able to ask questions and think through something critically and to use that term is not helpful. It kind of reminds me of using the term racist. It's just a way to shut down conversation. And that's not helpful, nor is it to anyone, and nor is it orthodox. And so I'd like to put that up first. Okay. Now, somebody can actually have bad arguments or bad reasons for holding to a position which you could then discuss and argue out. So what I want to see from people is they think critically through this, that they don't shut down, that they don't get emotional about this, first of all. They don't shut down conversation, critical thinking, questioning. And look, you can have a dialogue and you can even have an argument about these things. Was that a good argument? Is that actually good to think, or should we suppose this? That's all conversation that we can have. And I don't think that means, you're in the camp of thinking like flat earth stuff. So again, let's avoid these extremes, and let's avoid this ambiguous kind of language and these terms, especially when they shut down. They're not fruitful in any sense. Any thoughts about that? And then we can go. Well, this is happening a lot, and I think it's a problem that we should just stop. Give me an argument. Stop using these shutdown terms.
Yeah, I mean, this is just mindlessness. In fact, the Bible itself is full of instances of conspiracies that are real. If we think back to the book of Genesis, there's conspiracies relating to the brothers conspiring against Joseph. If we think about Exodus, there's conspiracies on the part of Pharaoh to get rid of the firstborn. If we think about the historical books, there's conspiracies against the person of David. Multiple conspiracies amongst the royals of the houses of Israel and the houses of Judah throughout the historical books. There's conspiracies in the prophets. There's conspiracies in the New Testament relating to our Lord, conspiring to get rid of him. Judas was a conspirer, engaged in conspiracy. On and on and on. The book of Acts, full of conspiracies to get rid of the apostles. The church has had a long history of conspiracies. There were conspiracies throughout the Byzantine Empire. History is nothing but espionage and conspiracy. So this is just total absurdity, total ignorance, total historical just stupidity to act like this term somehow by using this slogan that it somehow shuts down anybody's, like it's the trump card that you throw down to like shut down any kind of discussion.
Yeah.
So that's
checkmate.
Oh, you got me, bro. So that's one side of this, and then the other side is a kind of an extreme that we want to avoid too, with with over analyzing, questioning, and like you've been pointing out at the beginning, having no trust, right? And that's ironic because post Enlightenment we live in under the ethos that government is always wrong. Government is always to be viewed as a thing to be skeptical of, as if we're not supposed to be skeptical of giant private corporate interests. Like, right. So we're supposed to be worried about government, but what about private government? What about shadow governments? What about private armies? These kinds.
Yeah.
So that itself is a false dialectic of the Enlightenment, because it's really asking us to be skeptical of all authority. And who was the first person to get us to be skeptical of all authority? It was Satan in the garden. Has God really said this? Doesn't your authority, doesn't he want to keep you down? So Satan is the first revolutionary. So I would just stress that there's two extremes here that are obviously not historical, not biblical, not patristic.
Right, exactly. And so we notice this theme that keeps happening over and over again, this kind of rigid thinking, dialectics of either or kind of categories.
Which is a fallacy, either or fallacy.
We want to steer the middle course. We want to have proper respect, but not blind obedience to civil authorities. Even our jobs is a type of authority that we go to.
Good point.
That, there's many ways that we trust our authority, but that doesn't mean blind obedience. So we don't need, I'd like to just put that out. Don't think in these extremes. As Aristotle says, even his list of virtues are the mean proportional between the extremes of deficiency and excess, that there's a balanced, nuanced way. And some of these things, again, are not so clear. Some of these things are going to be difficult. And I kind of have a graduated scale from skepticism or disbelief up to mental assent, or how about consideration, probability, to actual mental assent, and even their different levels.
Why don't you bring in all the different papal qualifications of what level of assent is required?
Let me tell you. So according to my my own encyclical letter and papal lawyers, we've worked out a 500,000 point list
of docility, right? So you're at like a level 37,000 docility points with where you're at now, right?
But to read that encyclical letter, you're going to need to purchase my other Decoding the Encyclical Letters,
which tells you what aspects are infallible in that encyclical, right?
Well played. That was a great.
For $9.95, you can also get my decoder ring, which tells you how, right?
And what if I told you that I would throw in an extra copy of Scholasticism for Dummies? That's 3 items for the price of 1. But there's obviously, so there's the questioning that we should do. Question all things. And as far as kind of weighing the evidence, there's oftentimes that as I gather more evidence, and I always encourage my students this in philosophy class, is that they often get very frustrated because we're reading, some philosophy book here. This is what they're reading right now. Introduction to Philosophy. So it's an anthology of different philosophers. And guess what? They're all saying something different. Is there a God? Is there a universal consensus among philosophers on that? What is the correct moral philosophy, political philosophy? What's the proper understanding of the mind or soul? Is there a soul? There's really not consensus. And this causes the students to kind of fall into an epistemic despair of kind of relativism. Whereas science, by its very nature, being concerned with praxis and production, requires a universal agreement. Can you imagine, could we actually make or do anything if we're all sitting around and arguing about, like, I'm sorry, that's not how many elements there are. There's 4, and it doesn't have an electron, right? Nobody would be able to get anything done. And so just the very nature of science requires, within the paradigm at the time, that there has to be a consensus, at least on the fundamental paradigmatic level. Now, what does that do psychologically to people who study that? Well, they think that it's objective. And then what happens when somebody sees like a discipline like philosophy where everybody's saying something different? Well, it tends to produce in students that, I guess there is no objective answer on this because everybody's disagreeing. And I have to spend quite a bit of time. And part of the thing too is this, our society preaching relativism and there is no objective truth. I really have to have like the first couple of weeks be a rehab program for my students. A rehab out of the addiction of relativism and subjectivism. That there are objective truths. It might be difficult at times to obtain. But one thing that I encouraged is that, look, just because, people are giving multiple answers, because they're always like, well, who do I trust? I'm like, you can't trust any of these people. You can't trust any philosopher. Well, then I can't know anything. Well, again, that kind of extreme rigid thinking. I always just give them analogy of the detective. Just pretend you're a detective, a philosophical detective. But what does a detective do? A detective is full of skepticism about everybody he interviews, right? Always suspicious.
Right.
Probably actually always thinking there is a conspiracy. Right? These people are conspiring. Yet they don't throw up their hand when they're interviewing people and when they're getting different answers and when they're doing investigations and they can't trust anybody. It's not like they throw up their hands and go, you know what, I guess there really is no objective answer to who killed the person. So why can't we have that similar approach when it comes to issues of philosophy or evidence in general, or different groups giving different information? That you can't trust them. Yet at the same time, you're going to have to use them just like the detective does, is evidence. And the detective, that's hard work. I mean, isn't it easy in a science book or a mathematics book to just simply look up the answer and then it's there? But you can't do that with a lot of other issues. You can't do that in philosophy. And so this is a more painstaking task. It takes harder work, a lot more work. And typically what you have certain methodologies that you're doing. You're looking for contradictions, inconsistencies, and patterns. And again, there's going to be kind of an epistemic gradation of assent. So for example, when, let's say, you're distrusting information that's coming in, I think the first level is just like, I don't know. And a lot of us in this current situation are at that point. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Then you start to look through all the literature, all the different scientific journals, and everybody's saying things. and giving data. And you start to basically look for patterns. Also, I think it's important, just coming from the background of philosophy of science, that this is actually quite helpful for me, is that we had an issue occurred within the history of science and the philosophy of science called the fact-value dichotomy. There might be, and there was a time when scientists, and many scientists still today think this, that look, we just look at the objective data, we get objective facts. And the whole purpose of science is to carve off the kind of first person perspective and get this kind of third person objectivity without biases and values and prior beliefs and paradigms and religious commitments coming into. And the great thing that philosophy of science is able to show is that that's impossible.
Right.
This is the fact-value dichotomy. It doesn't mean that you can't actually get facts, but you're always working through paradigm lenses, and the factual world of data and evidence and argument is embedded with value, with human values and biases. That's why it makes it so much more difficult. And so science is not a purely objective, neutral enterprise.
Amen.
One way to see this is that the scientists aren't funding their own research projects.
Yeah.
Who funds their own research projects?
All the scientists have a GoFundMe, right? And then all of the Fedora people.
Actually, that's a great idea.
All the Fedora people put their Bitcoins into the GoFundMe, and then the science men come up with the neutral truths.
Yeah. So again, look, it's just like campaigning. People give money to political campaigns, want certain things in return. They want certain kickbacks. They're, just on a very small business level, this works too. Like, look, you do me a favor, I do you a favor. I don't think that's that bizarre to even think about. So what we have to understand is that science is funded by big corporations, groups. Yes, it gets endowments from the state too, but even that involves values. So it's not value neutral when it comes to, and I think that's really important when starting to look at evidence. And I know that you and I've talked about this when it comes to epistemology. This is one of my critiques of kind of what's classical foundationalism is. It's kind of, and as Sellers points out, no, every scene, the same data is seeing the data a certain way. There we go. Yeah, EPM. According to concepts, according to one's experiences. So there's a parallel to be drawn here with science as well. That, look, it's not just looking at the evidence. It's not just doing the research projects. And so when we too are looking at the evidence, we need to take these the values, the ideologies, the history of the corporations, where the money's coming from, seriously into account, because that's kind of going to give us a perspective. For example, I mean, if somebody, the clearest case would be how much would you trust the evidence of a scientific project if it was funded by the National Socialists? Like, people be like, well, I don't know, help me out with a better example.
Well, a lot of the early research that the world order is based on comes out of that mindset of phrenology and biometrics and all that. All comes out of Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and a kind of worship of DNA. So that has actually happened. Now, that's not to say that every scientific discovery is false
Right,
because of a false paradigm, because you can make discoveries that are true within an erroneous paradigm. But the point is that you have to understand these two different things. The facts and objects, phenomena, they don't come to you apart from or outside of a paradigm. They don't come in a vacuum.
So when being a healthy detective, when you're trying to accumulate evidence so that you can say, you know what, I think this might be the case. And again, like I said, I haven't graduated. I might say, I don't know, to, you know what, I'm starting to think more and more that this is the case. To, you know what, this is probably the case. I'm getting more evidence. I'm almost sure that this is the case. To probably the hardest is like, well, this is by all reasonable epistemic standards factual. Notice that this is even principles within law as well. Mm-hmm. That reasonable doubt. Okay, so there's standards that it's not like, well, I'm only going to assent to something that's just, I can't doubt, right? Do you know how many few things are actually indubitable that you end up doubting, you contradict yourself? But so law even uses certain epistemic standards. Yeah, but beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
Also, so that's going to be part of looking and accumulating your evidence and making a case, a reasonable case. It's like, I don't know, I could be wrong. And when more information comes in, you should always be open to revising your theory according to the data and evidence that comes in. But part of that is going to be looking at funding. What are the type of ideologies? What is the history of a certain corporation? Let's say even within a given individual scientist. I mean, what if a scientist is known for making fraudulent claims? Does that scientist or medical expert become trustworthy?
That's not really possible, because we know that scientists are all altruistic martyrs for the truth, so they would never do something like that, right? I mean, that's not really. Yeah. Once you don the lab coat, you sort of lose the other qualities that most human beings have associated with pride and vanity and deception. You become a sort of angel being, and you're only concerned with the truth.
Well, if you ever want to morally purify your both your heart and your intellect, you put on a lab coat. You get your Bunsen burner and your Irmar flask out, and then truly you will be the virtuous and pure intellect, the angelic intellect.
You become a pure angelic intellect once you don the lab coat and the Bunsen burner, correct?
Yeah.
Your intellect becomes a bright and shining Bunsen flame.
Okay, so where was I with the other thing too? So, okay, analyze things in terms of their paradigms. Have a healthy distrust and questioning. Look for contradictions and inconsistencies in reports. Look at the history, right? All these things actually would be argued in a court of law, wouldn't they? For example, establishing the character witness. Isn't that important? Why does it all of a sudden just these principles of healthy investigation and case building go out the window when we talk about science and the establishment and our authorities?
Yeah. For example, if many of these authorities are committed to an anti-human philosophy, a post-human world, why should I then accept that they are interested in saving lives?
Right.
Those two things contradict.
Exactly. So one thing that's really big right now too is, so we've got the abortion holocaust. Like I said, when looking at institutions and individuals, it might become important to see, do they believe in eugenics? Do they believe in, I call them the bioethical sins that we Orthodox would hold as actual sins?
Do they believe in putting drugs in the tap water, as many of the elite openly say?
Yeah. Do they, what are we told as Orthodox Christians? Be fruitful and multiply. What do we think about people who say that the world's overpopulated and needs to be depopulated? Depopulated.
Two different paradigms, two different worldviews.
Yeah. That these are going to become important factors within analyzing and making a case for something and whether you can trust. Also, I would say that, again, like a detective's going to look for patterns. So what I'm trying to avoid is that people, again, put things into these extremes that, well, I'm not going to assent to it unless it's indubitable, unless it's absolutely factual, or if it's just so ridiculous that we can just, throw it out. Because a person can always raise doubt. Yeah, but what about, couldn't this be the case? And couldn't that be? But at some point, you get enough, you develop a pattern. You get enough what we call coincidence. Because isn't this often the response when you're trying to make a case for something? I don't know if I should trust that. Or, you know what, I think this information might be false, or it is false. What do you typically hear in response? Yeah, but couldn't it be this way? Couldn't it? What if? Now, you can always raise the doubt in what ifs, but that doesn't mean that therefore you're warranted in not actually making a mental assent to accept that. In fact, we have in law something called the doctrine of chances. After so many coincidences, so somebody could be like, well, that's just a coincidence, isn't it? Might be. What happens if it happens again? It's a coincidence. So in law, they actually have a principle called the doctrine of chances. After so many number, it's actually reasonable assent, and you can actually prosecute and send people to jail or death based on the doctrine of chances. So many numbers of chances will actually stop being, by any epistemic standard, chance anymore, to the point that such a high standard that you can actually act and do something. You could put somebody in jail and prosecute somebody on that. So I'd encourage, we have a principle like that too. If you start to notice certain behaviors among institutions, or, yeah, but couldn't that just be him just saying this? Maybe. But how many times do you get the what ifs before you start to realize, you know what? I don't think so. I don't think it's just chance or some other type of explanation. So do you see how difficult this is? I want you to be really, really nuanced, not go into the extremes, have a healthy skepticism, but also, don't throw out some level of trust. Okay, so how does this relate to, again, what's going on? Well, all of us Orthodox are trying to figure out what's going on with this epidemic. We shouldn't live in fear. And what's really disturbing to me is that those who are actually trying to question the official narrative are being shut down. They're saying, you're a murderer, you want the whole world to die. That's not Orthodox. That's not helpful.
Can I bring up a question here? Something I've noticed, and this is what we see with like the radical social justice type stuff, is the same attitude of anytime that you critique something, disagree with something, don't like something, the assumption is that you therefore hate whatever you're talking about.
Yes.
This is a very bizarre either or fallacy that just always pops up. I don't know where this was instilled in everyone's mind through social justice stuff, but this is ludicrous. The idea that you hate anything that you critique, call out, disagree with, or don't like, this is absurd.
Yeah. So, for example, let me just give you a recent example.
You question something, therefore you want everyone to die. I mean, that's just like
Right.
insanity.
Yeah.
Like what?
No. We're all trying to work out the best solution. Okay. For us Orthodox, what makes it really difficult is that our government officials are not per se trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
Our government has not had a healthy human rights history. They have a history of doing very bad things to its own citizens, infecting them with, viruses.
Many examples, yeah. Tuskegee experiments, all kinds of things.
Yeah, releasing malaria
Mm-hmm.
in mosquitoes on Floridians, the San Francisco spraying of viruses, the MK Ultra experiments, many issues within the hospital itself and psychiatry that's very bad. So why do I bring, so all that stuff's just factual, and the list goes on and on. As far as, well, because that should at the very least give you a healthy skepticism that, you know what, I think it's okay to question our officials and hold them accountable on these things. Out on top of that, but these are people who have the opposite values of Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And then add on top of that, then you have non-government officials, let's call them officials, the technocrats, who don't seem to be have anything to do, have any medical critical.
No, they're not even elected. They're purely self-ordained experts in
saying they're going to solve this problem. And now it seems to me you have Gil Bates, like Gil Bates and others, basically not only controlling the narrative, but it seems like even the medical institution or even the state. That should be concerning for you Orthodox.
I mean, especially if, let's say you're a liberal, let's say you believe in democracy and elections and all this. Who elected Bill Gates, by the way?
Right.
Did you? No?
So I'm just presenting you. So me saying this is not a taking a position. That's the other thing, is that when I raise certain objections or would like a response from one side, we typically get this dialectics. So everything that that side's saying is wrong, and so you're supporting this person. Well, you can't fall into that. Again, these are just possible objections. I'm not even saying that I necessarily agree with this, but I'd like to see the objections answered. Is that so unreasonable? Again, you have Dr. Fauci, who's basically leading this, who, by the way, if you want to start developing connections and start building cases, has interesting connections to Gil Bates. And so he's given a certain narrative, and it seems that he has the whole kind of the control of what the narrative and all the information that's going on. Okay, so here's a recent episode. I found a professor, Nut Witowski, who was the head of the Rockefeller's Institute or University Department of Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design for 35 years. And what he does is take all the CDC's data, crunches this, makes the graphs, makes his analysis, and presents an argument against Dr. Fauci's analysis and solution. I present that as something to be considered. I don't know if he's right on this. Here we have somebody saying that quarantine and lockdown, taking children out of schools, is the worst thing possible. And that it's going to flatten the curve. But his theory is that the way that airborne respiratory viruses work is you need to naturally have that go through the society so they can develop a natural immunity to that. And that's how, and it's not to say that we can't actually develop drugs and stuff either. Now,
well, let's put it in a simple way. How do you know which experts to trust?
Right. This is the
under determination of data. Like, just because do we just take, oh, well, there's 75 experts on this side and there's 84 on this side. So the ones with the 84, obviously, no, how that's a fallacy. Right.
So that's a great question to ask. So everybody should be asking themselves these questions. We should all be thinking critically through this. And you should be holding your politicians and leaders accountable and ask them to give you answers on this. Is this a great question? That's not happening. And that's concerning to me. And in fact, the responses that you present, any possible contrary evidence that should be considered and discussed, is met with hate. Again, you want everybody to die. No, that's extremely disturbing to me. That, look, we're going to have to work through this. Now, does that mean that we don't take precautions? And again, I haven't even provided a solution to this. I don't know. I just want us to be more critical about and start finding counter arguments, counter data, and working this out together. I don't think that's an unreasonable position on that.
Yeah, a lot of people operate from a point of fear. I think if you've read, the classics of statecraft, if you've read Machiavelli, if you've read on how men are to be ruled from historic rulers' perspectives, you know that fear is a very important aspect. There are times when we should have a legitimate concern, or perhaps fear, depending on how you're defining that term, for our well-being or our loved ones and this kind of stuff. But then in many cases, we find out that fear is oftentimes not legitimate. It was based on deception. It was based on exaggeration. I mean, there have been countless examples of this in history, countless examples of governments concocting narratives and exaggerating, or not even governments, corporations, right? It doesn't matter. Yeah. Either one. Powerful entities don't always tell the truth. I think that should be obvious. And so healthy skepticism, right, should play into this. And also considering the possibility that there are entities that perhaps want us to constantly be in fear.
Right. Now, how would you, I've been thinking about this a lot recently because I get these responses from individuals that, okay, I'm not trusting it, and we can question it, but if what they're saying is true, and we don't do the lockdowns, we don't, give up our rights and live in this kind of totalitarian scenario, which, by the way, technically, if you talk to constitutional lawyers, is illegal. You can't actually do this without it actually being worked out within law, that whether this is actually proportional. So I don't know how that's going to play out later.
Well, I don't think the people at the top, they don't care about that. They don't care they care less about constitutional law.
Yeah, and which is no surprise. But what surprises me is that it doesn't seem that normal citizens care either.
That's true. Yeah.
Who cares? Okay, so how would we respond to this, though? Yeah, but what if? So I'm not saying the official narrative and everything the data and information that we're getting from the establishment and medical community is correct. But if they're correct and we don't do these things, wouldn't the consequences be so disastrous that it's better to be safe than sorry? This is a typical objection that comes up. What do you think about that? I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I've been thinking about that. Look, everybody has to sacrifice something because the potential, even if this stuff isn't true, but if it were true, if we didn't do what we're doing, it would be so devastating that it's better to be safe than sorry.
I'm not sure I buy that. I mean, that just allows powerful entities to essentially do whatever they want under any supposed pretext of, well, if you don't, right? I mean, what was this thing Fauci said? If one person dies, we're not going to lift up the quarantine or whatever. I mean, that's ludicrous. I mean, one person dies from the flu, one person dies from anything. It's just preposterous. So we're going to shut down the entire economy. We're going to have we're going to invoke a depression when the people who are mouthing all this are Malthusians. They want death. They love death. They have a covenant with death. And then we're supposed to accept what they say about the need to lock down to keep you safe. I mean, this is just preposterous. It's absurd in my view that anybody who has an IQ over 100 would believe any of this. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't illnesses and that there couldn't be situations where there is the need to do this kind of stuff, but it needs to be demonstrated, and I just don't think that it has been demonstrated that we're at that kind of a situation. I mean, I'm not seeing...
And by the way, technically in law, this is the exact argument that would need to be established in order for government to actually legally be doing what it's doing. So, I mean, if that's enshrined within our legal system, why am I considered such a freak for wanting the same thing or desiring or expecting the same thing?
Well, thus we see the incoherence of the Enlightenment ideology. On the one hand, the informed citizen is supposed to do what you're saying. The informed citizen is supposed to be up on all the facts and follow all the information and be involved in the process of debating all these things out. That's the Enlightenment ideal of the informed citizen. And at the same time, all these people who champion these Enlightenment ideals are now telling us that if you are the informed citizen, you are the evil person who wants everybody dead. It's ludicrous. But that's the secret doublethink that Orwell was talking about in 1984. He was talking about this very fact of revolutionary philosophy, that it is grounded in doublethink. And the doublethink works itself out over time into more and more absurd levels of contradiction. That's the whole point of 1984. Every day, Winston is faced with just outlandish, preposterous contradictions.
Yeah.
The same government that's making up the news in 1984 is the government that one day says they're at war with East Asia and always have been, and the next day says that they've never been at war with East Asia.
Right. And the other thing I'd say too is that, again, with this kind of either broad brush strokes, rigid dialectics of kind of either or non-nuanced thinking, that I'd like to warn, from the Orthodox perspective, we shouldn't engage in that. That this really is an oversimplification, that nobody analyzes, even in their day-to-day decisions, in terms of potential risk and evidence, determining whether they should act or not in this way. That, well, all I have to do is say, if that's true, what are the potential dangers of, and so I better not actually go outside, because potentially this could actually be true. Nobody operates that way in life. It's not that simple, right? You don't analyze in a kind of a risk reward analysis, potential risk, that could potentially really be bad, and versus otherwise it might be worth. There's a lot of other factors, namely, how accurate is the data coming in? How much can I trust the data, right? And so nobody just even lives that way on a day-to-day basis. The way that's kind of being, I would argue, that's being presented, that if what they're saying is true, it's better to be safe than sorry, because furthermore, I would say that again, that's going to require a certain level. You don't have to have perfect accuracy. But all of this is based on the information data that's being. How many people actually have the Corunka? Okay. We need to determine how accurate is that information? What are the means by which we have that? And I'll talk about that in a little bit, that there are tests for that. The reports of death, the reports of contagion, all these questions and the information and how reliable it is would be a factor in determining potential risk if what they're saying is true. So the other thing that I'm not seeing as a response is, or even addressed, what are the negative consequences of what we're doing economically, for the economy, for businesses.
You mean addressed by the establishment?
Right. So if the argument's being presented that, well, it's better to be safe than sorry because the potential risks far outweigh whatever negative consequences that, I'd like, therefore, you to get pretty specific then on that. Okay. There is not even a conversation about that, which is extremely troublesome. I'm going to need some more accurate numbers on that. Now, things that we do know that's going on, that we can say for sure, the negative consequences of what is going on, a forfeiting of all rights without kind of a due process, a legal process, a shutting down of the economy, perhaps a collapse in the economy. I don't even know how this is going to work out. Small businesses are considered non-essentials and are going to be out of work, but being capable, I can't consider, off the top of my head, are all these, are they going to be able to financially come back and be restored? The most vulnerable. Now you have, at least, I'm sure this is in other counties too, Los Angeles County, people don't have to pay rent for the next year. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't owe rent, but what's to prevent somebody let's say accumulating rent money that basically they owe. Mm-hmm. And they're just like, well, I can't pay for it. And they leave. What happens to them? So let's say you're a small landlord. You're not some big conglomerate corporation. You own the property. You're stuck with that. Mm-hmm. And now you have a year's of rent not paid to you because your tenant is now ditched. And it's like, what's worst case scenario? Your credit's ruined. How's that going to play out for property owners? Mm-hmm. What are we doing about, now that everybody's locked down and quarantined, addictions, from pornography to, there could, alcohol and drugs, or even recovering addicts who are going to relapse into, what about mental health issues? The numbers are on the rise. The suicides are on the rise. I'd like to see a conversation about projected negative consequences and whether that actually is proportional to the measures that are being put in place. Mm-hmm. No conversation. If I bring that up, then people, where do they go to?
Well, can't you just punch it into your moral calculus calculator magic machine and figure out what utilitarian outcome is the most pleasure producing in your moral?
I forgot about that.
Yeah, I think you've got one of them. Look behind you for that Texas Instruments moral calculus machine back there.
Oh, I've got my Descartes calculator that will do computations on all ethical.
I have the Bentham model. The Bentham model moral calculus calculator on my. It's an app. You can actually.
Here it is, my hedonic calculus meter.
You can actually download the app now, the Bentham app, and it'll tell you which actions are the most pleasure producing.
I see my bishop's writing me. Gotta go, guys. I'll talk to him later. Your Grace, if you're watching, and Master bless. I'll speak to it a little bit. So these are things that should be discussed. Now, speaking of bishops, that's a perfect segue. Probably no coincidence, Doctrine of Chances, guys, that my bishop just wrote me, because that's a sign that let's segue into the conversation about what's going on in the churches. Is it right to shut them down and postpone Pascha and Holy Week? Okay, so first things first, none of us Orthodox believe that disease or infection can be given through the Eucharist. So let's just get that off the table right there. Now, does that mean that you can't get sick in church? Sick from other people in church? Does it mean that after taking the Eucharist, you can't get sick? People say the church is a place of healing. So no, you can't get sick. But again, we're falling into this kind of rigid dialectics. I've gotten sick, not from the Eucharist, but from church after taking the Eucharist. As I always like to say, it's not a Mario star in which you can take and you become invincible and then run out into traffic. This is to test the Lord your God in this way. And so, other objections. But why are we fearing? We have nothing to fear. You know, we've gone through much worse. And now we have fear in the church. We don't have fear in the church. The bishops do not have fear. Okay. But notice the dialectics. You either have fear or what? And therefore no precautions? I mean, are those the two choices? I don't even need to take any precautions. We don't need to wipe down or clean the church in any way. If somebody's sick, you don't need to send them home. Again, this is this radical kind of rigid thinking that we should steer away from. So the other one that's come up is that, but we Orthodox Christians don't fear death. We've gone to our martyrdoms in history. Why are we all of a sudden, bowing down as soon as a virus comes in and shutting down the churches when the liturgy is so important? We shouldn't fear death. These are all things that the bishops have had to decide. And I've noticed some young zealots, probably converts, recent converts, newly illumined, that'll say that, you know what, all the bishops have become antichrists and have gone to the dark side and bowed down to the state's demands. That's not the case at all. So I want to address all of you that, I've spoken to many of the bishops. This was not an easy decision for them to do. They had to think through and actually appeal to experts both in law and canon law, theologians, medical experts. They're doing exactly everything that I was telling you in this video, being skeptical, trying to gather all the evidence while being precautious and make a decision. So to take precautions is not to say, well, then you must fear death, or we're all going to die. Who cares? Liturgy is the most important thing. What the bishops and your priests are concerned with is also life. We want to not be reckless. We want to take precautions because we want more time for people to repent. That's really the issue at hand. And so given the evidence And again, I don't think any of the bishops are saying we know for sure what's going on. They've weighed the potential risks and they had to make a decision. And they had to basically say, and this is just temporary, right? Remember, there's going to be a reassessment. There was 2-week reassessment and then so on and so on of what to do. So I know that this was very, very difficult for the bishops to make. They did it thinking that this will be best. Let's take the precautions right now. So in that case, they actually made a decision that, you know what, it might be for the time being safer then. And then they can reevaluate that. Now, let's talk about, you know, how do we trust our bishops? How do we know that they haven't fallen to the dark side? Okay, because you have these young guys on the internet who've converted to Orthodoxy that'll say that the whole church has fallen because the bishops are all antichrist and fallen to the state. Well, the way that we Orthodox operate, first and foremost, is that we know each and every one of us as individuals have prelised spiritual delusion. That we as individuals don't get things correct and make correct judgments. We don't have a great track record on that. And so what's the Orthodox solution to that? Well, it's the church. And ultimately, it's asceticism and spiritual fathers, holy elders. Because the way that we receive truth is not simply like the world does and picks up a book and you just study things hard enough. So again, it doesn't mean that it's faith alone. That's why I said, and the whole first part of this talk was about how to use your mind, how to love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to be critical.
Is this,
question all things.
Isn't this an example of synodality and the communal nature of the church? Don't we recognize that God gifts everyone in the church? There are doctors in the church, there are bishops in the church, there are elders in the church, there are even gifted lay people in the church who may know and have insight and you know,
and you use that.
Yes,
you make use of that. Furthermore,
I guess what I wanted to say about that is that none of us trust just ourselves as some kind of like atomistic individual. Even if we're an individual who has a lot of knowledge or a lot of education or a lot of history of theology, we're still kind of always kind of checking ourselves against everyone else. Hence why the church isn't the papacy. It's a synodal communal system.
Yep. And the other thing too is that, look, because I don't just trust myself, and the way that we receive truth, we can use our intellects, but we also use asceticism.
Mm-hmm.
And we turn to the holy, those who are more spiritually experienced, who are more pious than us, for consultation.
Mm-hmm.
To get wisdom and to find truth. And I find this really interesting in the current situation, that those who are my spiritual father, who by even priestly standards is very, very, very experienced, a very pious, holy elders, all these people, none of them are objecting and saying what the bishops have done is wrong. So who are you going to put your trust in? A young 17, 18-year-old convert who probably, more than likely, is operating solo, is not in consultation with their spiritual father. And that's something I want to talk to you all about in just a bit. who's saying the church has fallen, it's the end times, all the hierarchs have become antichrist? Or are you going to trust this naive, newly illumined convert who's not probably in conversation with their spiritual father, more likely in conversation with their own prelates? Or are you going to go to those who have the evidence of piety and wisdom and experience? I'm going to my spiritual father. I'm going to the elders, and I haven't seen any of them object that we've got a problem here. And so that's where I put my trust. And again, within the synodal community of the church too. So I encourage all of you, do not despair. The bishops had a very difficult time in making this, but I think it was prudent. I think it was wise. I think it's taking precautions. And we're going to celebrate Pascha. There's, discussions about actually moving the date. We can do that. So don't let this get the better of you. That's the evil one speaking to us and causing you to despair. So trust in the church, trust in your spiritual father.
Well, another thing too is that while there are times when we are called to obey a higher authority, in many cases where it's gray area, God doesn't expect us to always be the crusader and have to go around authority. If there's a situation where your bishop and your priest made this call, you don't have to worry about it. What are you worried about? It's not up to you. You know what I mean? You don't have to freak out over this. I actually am glad I don't have to make those kinds of difficult calls. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in that kind of a position. And it's not on you to have to solve every problem in the world. You're not going to be able to do that. So just relax. You know what I mean? There was a great quote. Issues. One of the elders that was just sent to me this week. I shared it on my Twitter, and now I've forgotten which elder it was. One of the elders had a great quote that laity will be saved just as much as monastics if they just don't grumble. It was a great piece of wisdom. He's like, if you just don't grumble, he's like, you're as spiritual as a monk, is what he said, basically.
Yeah, maybe that's really hard for laity.
I'll look and see who that was, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good quote. There's so many things that the bishops had to consider. You forget too that a lot of these priests, have families or large families that are covered by insurance if they were to get sick. And now you have an extra layer of complication that if you don't abide by the laws that the state's setting down, insurance companies are saying we're no longer going to cover you. Now, and who knows all the other ramifications too, different insurance coverages that would be revoked. Is that fair? It's what I'm trying to explain to you is it's not so simple, right? There's all these factors that they're having to weigh.
Oh, that's a good point.
That it's not simply, do we believe that the church is a healing presence and can heal us of all disease or not? And if we shut it down, then we're not real true believers. By the way, all these people are going to end, that are taking this radical line, often end up becoming schismatics. So beware.
It's Elder Paisios who said, if laymen do not murmur, they will receive the same reward from God as an ascetic monk.
Wow.
So the hardest thing for a layman to do is to not mumble and grumble and murmur.
I'll make sure when I get back to church, I'll actually wear a sign with that quote.
Right.
When I walk into church. Here's the other thing too. This was, and I can't remember what priest had brought this up. So again, what I want to encourage you is, look, we have a proper way of dealing with this. I'd like everybody to be staying in contact with their spiritual father and not making decisions by themselves. Okay, it's really important at this time that, and if the priest is overwhelmed with phone calls, maybe write a message and schedule. Is there a time where we can talk? Okay, can we set aside some time to talk? Second, you need to follow your bishops. And because every jurisdiction has a little bit of different rules. Some jurisdictions, the bishops are allowing and have been allowing up to 5 people to congregate. Now, the American, let's see here if I get the email that was sent to me so I could just read to you real quick. Yeah, here we go. This is a recent. No, that's not it. It's the Assembly of Bishops and. Hold on, I got it right here. 1 second. The statement of the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops of the United States. So they met recently, I think April 3rd, and they met with obviously various jurisdictions, and they considered state and federal regulations, CDC recommendations, how to implement this within parishes around the country. So even if what they're saying about the Corunka virus isn't as bad as, still, let's say it's as bad as a bad flu, there still needs to be precautions that are taken. They met with law enforcement, insurance officials, so I told you, public health consultants, pastoral care professionals, like I said, canon lawyers, and they reached a consensus that of these bishops within these jurisdictions, they're recommending services be celebrated by a maximum of 5 people, which would be obviously the priest. So you get the deacon or deacons, cantors, or servers, no more than 5. And here we have Archbishop, the Greek Orthodox Church of America, Metropolitan Jonah of the Antiochian Orthodox Church. Archbishop Michael is the treasurer of the Orthodox Church in America. Metropolitan Gregory is the secretary of this committee. From the American Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Diocese, Bishop Aaron, Serbian Orthodox Church here. Metropolitan Nikolai, the Romanian Orthodox Metropolitan of America. So that's different than, that's under the Patriarch of Romania. So my jurisdiction is the Romanian Episcopate. So we're separate from that. That's often a source of confusion, and we're attached to the OCA. So what that means is, like we see here, Metropolitan Tikhon signs that. However, we follow the guidance of Archbishop Nathaniel. So since Archbishop Nathaniel might not have said this, then we, just because these bishops recommend it, we're under the obedience of Archbishop Nathaniel. Bishop Saba, the Georgian Apostolic Church, and Metropolitan Joseph, the Bulgarian. Okay, so these are guidelines. Listen to your bishop. My bishop has, Archbishop has restricted, has been a bit more strict on that. And that might be because of issues with the insurance and the larger elderly. So we just have to trust and obey. Okay, this is going to be reevaluated. Now, there was something really interesting that I can't remember. I think it was a priest. I don't think it was the bishop. Because each bishop might have different guidelines. And as I encourage you, you follow your bishop, which jurisdiction you're in, and your priest. Some bishops have been more flexible as far as I think the numbers. Now, part of the problem is that people are really frustrated about, oh, my parish is closed. I can't go to liturgies. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to this other jurisdiction. So they end up jurisdiction hopping. Now, before even the Corunka lockdown, I've already seen young people do this. They jump from every Sunday, they're at a different parish. Okay. Now, there's a couple problems with this, and I've been even, given told by priests to talk to the young people about this because of the problem. So they send the deacon out to speak about this. When you're first looking for a parish, that might be okay, but you need to find a home parish. And I even recommend volunteering some type of service, whether that's coffee hour or cleaning, something like that. Because guess what? We're not Protestants. We're not Protestant evangelicals where this is for you and your entertainment and simply your spiritual benefit. You're a member of a community, and you need to work to help them, and you have certain responsibilities. And so if you're jumping to a parish each Sunday, who are you really thinking about? Are you being canonic in your spirit and thinking about the others? Or are you thinking, you know what, I want to go see my friends over here. I want to go to this church this week because that's cool. And you're doing a disservice to your own community. So what priests have asked me to talk to the young people about, and multiple priests, even my own father confessor, that first of all, don't be going to other parishes or other jurisdictions without your spiritual father's blessing, or your priest's blessing.
I had to get permission to do that.
Why is that so hard? Okay, do you want to acquire everybody in there? You guys? Hello? Hello? They fly. Do you? Well,
can you repeat that? You cut out. You cut out there.
The internet was stable.
Yeah, go ahead and repeat that.
If you want to acquire the spirit of the church and not a spirit of the world, we're not Protestants anymore. It isn't sola mia. You don't make your own decisions. Okay, stay in contact with your spiritual father. Now, you're not under obedience. You're not at the same level as me. But when it comes to things like that, you should be talking and getting the blessing of your spiritual father. Father bless, may I actually this Sunday go to the other parish? Certainly, you should be confessing to the same priest.
I'm sorry, you got me laughing.
What's that?
Sola fide, sola gratia, and sola mio.
Sola mia.
Hello,
McFly.
The forgotten operatic Protestant sola.
They forgot one of the solas, yeah. That it's going to be for your own spiritual growth and benefit if you do that. Certainly, you shouldn't be confessing to other priests without talking to your spiritual father. It's kind of like doctor shopping, isn't it? When I think about it. You go to one doctor for some medication, and then another.
It's not the medicine you want, so go down the road.
Like,
to
yeah. Like,
yeah, man. When you
gonna prescribe me
prescribe me the pills I want, man.
One doctor prescribes you a medicine that ends up contradicting you, producing a contradiction to the other medication that the other doctor prescribes.
Yeah.
I think there's a spiritual analogy there too. That, different priests have different kind of methods and different medicines they could apply. And if you're confessing to different priests, especially on a regular basis, you might end up having a spiritual heart attack, dude. You don't want a spiritual heart attack. You might have some serious problems. So again, there might be some situations where it's like, you know what, I really need to go to confession and I can't. My priest isn't going to be able to do a confession. Well, what happens if you can't get a hold of your priest? Why don't you just talk this out with your spiritual father or priest ahead of time? Father, what happens if I've done a sin? I want to actually take the Eucharist, or I need to do a confession and I can't get a hold of you. In a scenario like that, do I have your blessing to go to so-and-so? Okay, so think ahead, okay? Otherwise, you're just like, well, I couldn't get a hold of him. So, and the other thing too, the Eucharist isn't an entitlement. You don't, you know, it's ideal that we take it as much as possible, but sometimes we need a time of repentance and reflection. We just celebrated Saint Mary of Egypt. And right now we're kind of in a Lenten fast from the liturgy and Eucharist, and we need to focus on our own repentance and not go, oh man, I just wish I could get, it's not fair. This is kind of a spirit of entitlement. We all wish that we had the Eucharist. But you know what? God's allowed this as a Lenten fast from the liturgy for us to reflect and repent, much like Saint Mary of Egypt and Saint Zosimus in the desert. Look how long they went. Are we better than they are? Are we entitled to the liturgy and the Eucharist? So stop complaining and grumbling, right? Do your job, and your job is to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So to sum up, be in contact with your spiritual father. Don't be going to other parishes without their blessing. In fact, one priest warned that because some bishops under their jurisdictions might be less stringent, have more people allowed within their parish, other people without the blessing of the spiritual father are going to these parishes and causing problems because they want it, right? They're not thinking of the other person. What if you're infected? Now you've got a larger community. What if that endangers the priest in the church in terms of legal authority? I mean, they're already arresting people for having church services. Stop thinking about yourself. How do you do that? First things first, go talk to your spiritual father. Get a blessing, right? Otherwise, you're acting on your own, in your own prelist, and your own zeal, and you're going to end up in a dangerous place. So I think that's really important for especially the youth to hear right now, and those that have a lot of zeal when it comes to, and zeal's not a bad thing. This is just the kind of checks and balance. Too much zeal, unbridled, actually can be a very, very dangerous and bad thing. So I'm just trying to give you some simple points of kind of checks and balances, how, you know, make sure we don't end up in danger, spiritual danger.
Yeah, the checks and balances are here for our own good. Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that was really good. I think that's great advice. I don't know how to handle this kind of a situation, so I don't want to be in charge of that. So yeah, it's a situation where all we have to do is do what our elders tell us to do and not worry about it. And again, we don't really have anything to fear. So,
and that's not a clericalism. That's why I said, look, if you started to, you know, we don't just say, well, the priest is always right at every time and every place. And, you know, if you start getting contradictory information from other wise and holy people, then you can ask them how to deal with that. But we're not getting that right now.
Another thing I've learned too as I've gotten older is that a lot of times these kind of situations where there's confusion, time is actually what solves these. In time, things become clear. So we don't have to freak out because in the immediate we don't have the answer, right? I've had situations in the past where there were really difficult theological things I didn't have the answer to. And I was like, I've got all the books. Where's the answer? And it was God's providence that brought that answer to me a year, 2, 3 years later in a different book that person that I talked to that knew more than me. So don't freak out and just relax.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be the scenario too. With we're bombarded with information. We don't know what like I said, we can trust.
Yeah, time will tell.
Time will tell. Again, we're starting to build some cases, at least to the point that should be to discussed and objected. For example, are the numbers that are coming in that accurate? For example,
well, the establishment people have been scaling it back.
So they've actually
Big
been
time.
scaling it back because we're getting new data, but we're acting based on the old data. So let's just pull up real quick. As of today, and again, I'm not saying this is the infallible Cartesian guide to indubitable certitude with your Benthamite hedonic calculus 3000 that's computated these with apodictic certainty.
Yes, exactly.
But these are some numbers that we're going to use within our evidence, okay, that are being reported thus far. So total reported cases in the United States as of today, 400,000. That means 77 new cases. Total deaths, 12,000. Okay, new deaths, 3. Okay. Now what's interesting, those sound like large numbers. Keep in mind that the United States has a population of over 330 million people.
Yeah.
At this point, that actually looks to be 1 to 2%, which would be normal numbers of flu season. Now, something, that doesn't mean it's not serious or anything that shouldn't be dealt with, but I'm just giving the raw kind of numbers. Also, part of the reason why they're scaling back and readjusting is because the tests that we have for testing for the infection, like for the SARS-CoV-2, which is the Corunka virus that causes the COVID-19. There's, I guess, 2 different ways to test for that. One, I guess, is really sensitive, and it looks at for the RNA of the virus using a technique called RT-PCR. And the second one is a test to measure the antibody responses to the virus in the blood serum. So obviously one might be the first one's probably more accurate than the second. But what's difficult, they're not perfectly accurate. They had been given false positives, false negatives in in some of that. And so we're basically, the initial reports coming in were based on that. Also, as far as the deaths go, a lot of deaths were reported for, let's say you actually tested positive for, so there's a statistical probability right there whether that would actually be accurate. So there were misdiagnoses for. A lot of this were other viruses or flu symptoms that you test positive for. So it's not that accurate.
Right.
But even let's say you got it right, and then you die. Okay. A lot of these deaths were initially reported as deaths from the Corunka 19, where they might not have been. For example, and people always say, well, perfect, healthy 27-year-old with no medical problems came in and he died and he tested positive. So what else could it be? That's really bad reasoning in science. How many times have we heard 27-year-old, no underlying medical conditions, no underlying heart conditions, died of heart failure out of the blue? Okay, so what if that person tested positive for the Corunka? A lot of these numbers, initial reports, they were thrown in within that. Now that they're getting a bit, like you said, Jay, more time to analyze data and make corrections, they're actually starting to then correct some of these numbers. So again, people throwing out all these numbers and making, let's say, radical fear-based decisions on that might not actually be justified or warranted. because the data is still coming in. The tests aren't accurate. And what we usually get is presented that, well, they're telling the absolute truth all the time, and we've just got to trust with this. So hopefully that through our discussion today that we taught, look, there should be some healthy skepticism. We talked about science, how to analyze data, how to use evidence as far as certain epistemic bars that would warrant action, taking precautions, taking a nuanced and balanced view of all things considered. So that's kind of what I want to leave people with.
Awesome. Absolutely. Yeah, that's great advice. And thank you, Father Deacon. And if you would, please share this. Obviously, this will be on his channel. So thank you for having me on and letting me speak to you about this stuff. And I would just remember to listen to your Psalter, pray your Psalter, and don't get scared, don't get worried.
And if you're in trouble, call the Deacon hotline at 777-7777.
It's on the Bentham app, right? It's on the Jeremy Bentham app. If the moral
download that Bentham app.
Yeah. If the moral calculus doesn't work, it'll just give you Father Deacon's number, and you can call him, and he'll tell you what will make you the happiest.
And pray for your family and your neighbors. Try to use this time as repentance. It's not only Lent, but because of everything, the evil's growing in the world. I've actually saw something that there was a lot more reports of demonic affliction being reported. Nepsis, watchfulness, be on guard, and talk to your spiritual father. Be smart about this. And what other advice? Stay away from sugar.
Put the cookie down, as Arnold says.
Sugar, drugs, and alcohol. Bad. No, a little alcohol might actually be good for the Corunka. Right?
Could be. I don't know. I don't expect, Lord willing, to get the coronavirus. I mean, I really am.
Yeah, by the way, most people that get it are going to be asymptomatic. The far majority. Everybody else will have mild symptoms. There's a very small percentage. So that's why.
So for all we know, it's just a cold, right? Like a common cold.
Yeah. Again, concerns for us is that given the nature of the state and things like this, they utilize this. I'm not convinced the state's there for our well-being.
Yeah.
Certainly because they don't share the same values as me.
Right.
But of control. The last largest episode that we had was 9/11, and the constitutional rights that were so easily revoked, and the Patriot Act and these various things, the way airports are now, that was never rolled back. And so there's concerns that it's not like when the state gets an opportunity to seize power and surveillance, control things, medically monitor you, that out of a time of crisis, when people so reluctantly, give up, should I say, easily give up their rights because of fear, it's not like the state, after they get out of crisis, goes, okay, let's return back to normal. So we could expect that it's going to continue like this. Don't despair, though. Again, the city of God, right, versus the city of man. The city of man will not triumph over the city of God. And the Bill Gates of hell will not triumph
That's funny.
over the church.
All right. Thank you, Father. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Blessings, brother.